tyFlow Basics, PhysX Binds in Depth Part 2. Enjoy. Let's reaffirm our basic understanding of binds. We'll do 6 little quick projects. This one here, 27 boxes. It's a variation of the squeegee ball. I've positioned all the boxes manually with plenty of gap in between so we can see the binds. One thing that we learnt is the more binds that we have cross-connecting everything, the more stiffer the animation is going to be. So right now we're looking at rigid joint, and if we just animate that quickly, we can see we've got a very stiff box being held together. If we turn off the binds, then you can kind of see the effect that you would get. Alright, turn back on the binds. Now, the big dramatic difference between rigid joint, where we can control everything, and distance tether is, even though we have so many cross connections, with distance tether, the binds are allowed to spin an angle in any direction you want, or they want, alright? So we're going to get like a collapse. So the other thing that we want to reaffirm is, if we don't enable collisions, they're all going to be allowed to penetrate. So we got boxes that are cutting through and penetrating into each other. So by enabling the collisions, at least you'll prevent them from intersecting. So just remember, enable collisions. But straight away there you can see the big dramatic difference between the distance tether and the rigid joint, right? And the nice thing about the rigid joint is you can control a lot of that here, right? So let's just do something quickly. 200, let's do 1500 here. Let's enable swing, 1500 and 200, and enable twist, 1500, 200, and see what happens, right? So you can see, with this really cool control you get in rigid joint, you can do some really cool stuff. I mean, we're just playing around here. So if we allow more swing and more twist, we're going to get even more kind of dramatic effect here. Let's do 150, for example. Oops. And do 150. And now we add a little bit of more stretch to the bind. So, and of course we've got a lot of cross connections, but you can see just because of the amount of cross connections, how it limits the collapse of the particles, right, of the binds. So, keep in mind that you have a lot less control with these two no matter what you do, right? They're just not going to behave the same because of this. Can spin, twist, pivot any way they want on the binds. So I think these two are mostly useful for rope scenarios, some sort of suspension scenario, but even then I would find that sometimes I might just use rigid joint. Let's do a quick rope scenario. Alright, so how do we make something like this, where we're going to put a rope, string, or something suspended between two posts? I've pre-set up the scene, and there's nothing here extraordinary. We just made 2 cylinder posts, we berthed them over here, and we turned them into PhysX mesh shapes. And mesh means kinematic, it doesn't move, doesn't animate, and stuck in place. Alright. And just to show you troubleshooting stuff, I've added this collider cylinder here, which if this string falls, it should actually hit this cylinder or pass through it, depending on what we've done with our spline setup. And then over here, if I turn off tyFlow, I've got 2 strings, and the reason I have is I'm going to show you a potential problem. And the top one is the one we're using right now, which only has 2 vertices, one at the beginning, one at the left, and it doesn't have any Bezier settings. This one has Bezier on this right hand side, which is going to cause a problem or potential problem. But let's stick with the top rope for right now, and then we just give this spline some shape. So we turn it into geosphere medium res, and then we turn those into PhysX shapes and just convex hull, right? So, and then we are going to do a rigid joint right now, show bindings, and we're showing the binding color in a, let's see if we can get somewhere like a bright orangey color. Alright, and so let's turn tyFlow back on. That's the basic scene. Alright, tyFlow back on. So here we are. If we zoom right in on the top left here, you can see, maybe that's not a good color, let's do a blue. Alright, so you can see the binds between the joints here, right? First of all, you've got to be careful with this bind setting because there's actually overlapping binds. So if I turn off the display geometry, you can see things don't look quite right. And sooner or later I'll get this a better color. Alright, you can see the binds don't quite look right. Look at the spheres and then look at the binds. That's not how it should be. We should just want a connection between each sphere. So we've got some overlapping connections. So first of all, there's a problem because you're not getting the response you want with these connections, and that's the default setting. So if we go down to our bind here, and we can see that there's no way there's 25 centimeters between those binds, and we really don't need 3 connections. We really any one particle should be okay with 2, right? So if we do 2 to start with, that already changed things, right? And then if we decrease this down to about, like, it should only be about 1 centimeter between the binds, now we can see that we've got a nice even bind set up here, right? And the binds are spaced evenly. That's how it should have looked. So be aware, don't just accept default settings. They might cause you problems later. Let's turn on the shape again just so we can see that everything looks good. We have the beginnings of a rope or a string or whatever you want to call it. So now we have the basic setup. Let's just test collisions and everything, right? We turn it on. We can see we have what should be behavior like a rope. Now going back to what I said earlier, right, about the bind or the balls colliding, if you don't take that in consideration, let's say we have something like 10, you can see that it's actually going to go right through, right? Because there's not enough. Well, right now it's because the distance is not enough to make a bind, right? We don't see the bind, so we have to increase the distance as well a little bit here. Let's do 5, right? And at the moment it's still hitting, but if we come back here and we do something like 8, and we have to increase the bind again, and it's trying to cut through. See there, it's just getting caught on the 2 spheres, but you can see that if these spheres were just a little bit further apart, this would actually not collide. So that's the point I'm trying to make here. Just be aware that you have to space your spheres at a distance that's appropriate for what you're trying to do. If all you're trying to do is suspend it in midair and make it look like a rope between 2 poles, then you can pretty well do whatever you want as far as the distance, right? So if we roughly go back here to our 3% along, and then go back in here and return this to, I think it was 1 centimeter. Alright, and everything looks good. So now we have the beginnings of the rope, except it's not suspended. We turn on our spline paths. Now we're using a PhysX shape, so we want to do PhysX bindings. That's what's going to make the rope from, is the PhysX binding. So we can technically turn off our shapes, and we have what looks the beginning of a rope. We just turn this on so we can see our spline, and we maybe decrease this to something more like 0.5 over here, and there's our kind of rope, and it's colliding and it's looking good. If we come down here, I've already turned on the weld knots, but if you look here and you don't have that on, you'll see all these breaks in the mesh, and by hitting the weld bindings you close those up, right? If we now, how do we like suspend this in air? Well, one way would be to lock the left and right particle, turn it into a kinematic shape, and that'll hold either end in place. Let's do that. Alright, so let's turn our display geometry back on, turn display and pass off for a minute. We'll zoom on the top left hand area here, and we will turn on display data, and we see that the left particle is 1, and if we do the right zoom, we see that the right particle is 34. So particle 1 and particle 34 is what we want to make kinematic objects, right? So let's do that. We'll turn display data off, and we come in here and we go PhysX switch, and we want to make it kinematic. But if we do everything now, that's all of them, right? So that's a problem. See, they all became kinematic, right? So now we need to use our whole filter thing. So we go into filter, enable filter, and say add, and it's going to be the birth ID equals 1. So that's the left one. Now the left one is locked in place. Alright, there you go. Let's turn off display data. And by this point I've forgotten what the right one is, but anyway, we add another tab, PhysX switch, and we will do kinematic and filter and add birth ID equals 34. I hope. Yep, there we go, we got it right. Alright, so now we've locked those two particles in place, and now we have a suspended rope that might need some tweaking because of vibration or whatever and slowing, but we can now turn off that, and there you go. That's how you might make a rope suspended between two posts. Let's do a couple more quickies, but there you go. So remember, I had two lines drawn, right? This bottom line has a problem which isn't obvious at the beginning. Even if we kind of look at the vertices, everything looks good, but when we go into tyFlow view, and I've already switched to that line instead of the one that we just worked on, and it's perfect. First of all, you notice how you have a nice spread, even spread of particles, but then down here all of a sudden we have a whole collection of extra particles. If we turn off the shape so we can see the ticks, you can see that it actually increases in density on this vertex. What that means is it must have started to make a curve when we were creating the line. So if you kind of see this result in your tyFlow thing, you either want to redraw that line. I don't know if we can go in and fix it. I don't think so. If we look at this vertex, it's a corner. If we look at this vertex, it's a bezier. I don't know if turning it into a corner will fix it. Let's see. Let's go back into tyFlow, and that actually did fix it. But if we go back now, everything looks good on that bottom line, and we'd be good to go. So just keep that in mind. If you see a gradual increase in the number of ticks or particles, it's because it's part of a Bezier curve. If we want to address this slightly excitable beginning, where the rope seems very springy and jittery, we could just add a slow operator. So 5 probably won't quite be enough. Maybe it is. No, I'd go maybe 20. See what happens. And we can see it actually calms down very quickly. And then if you want to start from a static kind of non-bumpy rope, you would just start at a later frame from your animation. Well, that's kind of it. I mean, I suppose you could even try and do something like a slow operator on frames. Like, let's say we did something like frame 0 to 5, and then we actually did something like 90%, and let's see what happens. Alright, so you see we calmed it down very quickly, right? And it actually shouldn't be active anymore because we only set the timing to be from 0 to 5. So but that's one way of there's two ways of kind of slowing your rope down. So I've modified the flow a little bit. First, I decreased the number of birth particles along our string. Let's turn off the spline path for a minute, right? And this was originally at 3%, so we had that, right? And I've made it 10 so that I get more gaps, because I wanted to show you how you could attach something to this rope using a bind. So when I did that, obviously up here on the rope part of things, I had to lengthen my distance. So this was originally at 1 to maintain the rope. So everything still works. And of course, the number of particles changed. So when we had our kinematic switch here, I think it was 30 something, I just changed that to 11. So that's a fairly simple process as far as making those changes. And now if we turn our this spline path back on and turn this off, we have the rope like we had it before, except it's now using less spheres. And I've lined up, if we turn tyFlow off, I've made this little torus knot, so as if we're going to make it look like there's a knot in the rope, right? So I've sized it appropriately for the blue rope, and we go back into tyFlow, and I've positioned it right where one of those spheres happened to be, and right dead center on the line, because it's going to end up gluing kind of where you place it, right? So now if we go back into our tyFlow and we turn on this, you'll see what appears to be a blue knot in the middle of the rope, and it's fully animating with the rope. So we actually attached a knot using a bind, and it's pretty simple. There's our torus knot I birthed. I just converted it into a PhysX shape with a convex hole, and then I used rigid glue. We don't need to show the binding. And probably the most important thing is you don't want any more distance than you need to, because if you have too much distance, it's going to try and attach to the other particles. So when you're going to do something like this where you're using multiple binds, then you just want to be aware of all your various settings. But that kind of gives us this cool look, as if we have a knot in the middle of our rope. So, you know, we can easily make more of those if we want. We can have multiple knots, but it's just an idea, and it shows you how you can just attach other things to bind to your particles with more binds. Let's say I wanted to add a couple more knots just for the hell of it, right? If I turn on my layer to show my actual knot, you can see there, and then we can turn off the spline path for a minute and just display the geometry. If I clone this knot over here roughly in line with that one, and then do it again over here, and we want to be in the center of the string, like I said. Now we've got our placement pretty well correct. If we went in here to birth objects, we could add those two knots to our particle system. And if we now turn off all our poly objects and just go back to the particle view and turned off the display of the data and turned the spline pass back on, you can see now we have a cool rope with 3 knots that will totally interact with the flow. Zoom in a little bit. I mean, there you go. Let's try and make something that uses continuous mode for binding, and see if we can make something like a sticky ball or something. Alright, let's look at this sticky ball situation, right? And unfortunately it introduces some complexity, because we need particle groups for this sticky ball to work in this scenario. And I didn't want to complicate the tutorial anymore by adding more topics. So I'll do an electromagnet instead, but I'll still go over this and how it works. Because we're going to have to turn on binding in a continuous mode in timing. So far we've been doing on event entry only, and we can pretty well control what it binds to, because it only happens once during the flow. But on continuous binding, it's going to try and connect to something every frame, and in this instance, without grouping, the ball would actually connect itself to the ramp, in which case the ball will no longer go down the ramp. And so to prevent this behavior, we end up introducing groups. Now, in essence here, the core kind of philosophy behind grouping is that, for things to interact once you've enabled grouping, they have to be on the same group or in the same group. Now, you can have overlapping groups, like, you can have one item that's part of several groups and stuff like that. And just the way I'm talking right now, if you don't know about groups, it's going to start to complicate things, right? But let's delete this bind line, and let's just look at this and kind of move on, but we'll do the electromagnet. So the ball here is supposed to roll down this ramp, and as it rolls over all these tiny balls on the floor, it'll pick up whatever it happens to run over. And we already said that we needed to prevent it to attaching itself to the ramp. So what we did for the ball was we said, okay, the ball is going to be a member of group 1 and 2. So that means the ball can interact with anything in group 1 and group 2. So that means the ball will roll down the ramp because it's in group 1. Now, an interesting thing is tyFlow main settings also has groups for the floor. So if we enable this but don't go over to main settings, then the ramp and the ball and all the other balls will actually fall through the floor, because they're not in the same group. So what we have to do is go over in tyFlow main settings and enable group 1 and 2. So if you bear with me, the ramp is now in group 1, which means it won't fall through the floor because it fulfills this group 1 and 2 thing. Same with these balls that are in group 2 will also hit the floor. So that still doesn't solve our bind problem, because the ball is in group 1 and 2. It needs to be able to interact with both the ramp and the balls, the tiny balls, right? But what we can do is on the binding itself, we can also set a group. So that means when we're continually searching to make a bind on each frame, it's only going to try and bind with items in group 2, which at this moment is the floor and the small balls. Well, the binding can't make a connection with the floor, right? So it's going to only bind with the small balls, and the most important thing in here is to kind of play around and get your bind length exactly right, so that it looks like the small balls are attaching very close to the surface of the big ball. So even though I didn't intend to introduce groups to this tutorial, that's a quick overview but we'll look at the flow and we won't spend too much more time on this. For clarity, even though we're not going through this flow step by step and creating it, I should have mentioned that. So even though we had the ball here in group 1 and 2, the PhysX Bind Operator also has groupings, right? So when we scroll down here, you can see right now the ball is stuck to the top of the ramp because the bind, even though we have it set right here, the bind also has a groups, right? And because there's no group set, it's going to bind to whatever it can see. And even though it's hard to see because of the distance, you notice a little yellow line right here binding the top of the ramp to the ball. And if we do the slider, you can see the ball doesn't actually fall. So because we made sure the ramp was in group 1, we just got to come over here to our PhysX bind and say, you're part of group 2. Now you see that the bind disappeared and the ball actually moved into place on top of the ramp, and now it'll actually roll and interact. The other thing I should have said was, this slow spin here is as we get towards the end, and I was trying to prevent the ball from sitting and spinning, I actually set the timing to be roughly at the end of the frame where I knew that it reached the end of these small balls. And last but not least, for some strange reason which I haven't seen too often, the ball kind of wanted to spin sideways a little bit on its own. I don't know if that's a bug or what, but the easiest way to kill that was actually to turn it into a kinematic object, which means it's no longer dynamically driven. And I did that once I knew that the big ball was way past all the small ones, had really kind of stopped rolling. So I said at frame 120, become a kinematic dead object, right? So it definitely comes to a stop at frame 120. Which means even though we're not sitting and recreating this whole flow step by step, there's enough information here that technically you can do it. Alright, so let's have a look at a simple electromagnet like you would see in a junkyard. Whatever, where the magnet lowers, they turn on the magnet and then it picks up some items in the junkyard. We're just going to use simple objects and simple shapes, but this is the layout. So we're just going to have a sphere at the top to attach our rope to, and that is going to be keyframed, so it goes down and then after X frames it comes back up. We're going to bind the rope to this top sphere that's animated, keyframed, and we're going to make an electromagnet that's then also bound to this rope. Just have 3 random items on the floor, in this case simple cube, sphere and cylinder, and we hope that when it comes down we'll see the rope buckle and everything and then pick up these items if the binds allow it. The IDs of the particles, so in our spline in this current setup I'm just going to have 2 to 12, so 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to 12, and the top one here, the keyframe one, is ID 0 and ID 2, but let's go into Max for a minute and have a look at that. Alright, so let's have a look at the Max setup here. So here's our little setup that we had in the drawing. We've got our electromagnet, we've got our items on the ground. If you remember, the electromagnet is particle 13, and we've got 14, 15, and 16 on the ground. So when we play our little animation, even though it hasn't been finessed, and even though we haven't used spline operator on here to make the rope look like a rope, we're just seeing the binds and the spline spheres that we made, but we can see that it is going to act and look like a rope, right? And apart from maybe being a little bit jiggly at the end, and if we look here, the bind is too far, so this is kind of really hanging, this cylinder is really hanging in midair, so a little bit of a tweaking, we kind of have the makings of an electromagnet in action. And this kind of showcases a few different things we've talked about, but let's go through the flow you really didn't need to see me model this stuff, but we'll go through it. So if we look at it in the off, tyFlow off, so here's the scene at the right here, at the top right here, and so this top sphere is this top sphere here. We've just made a small sphere, we've keyframed it. So if I select that sphere, we can see the 3 keyframes here on 0, 40 and 80, and we can see that it moves down and up so that it has enough range of motion to come down with the magnet and touch the objects at the bottom. And we give that shape the mesh hull, and I generally do that whenever I am overriding PhysX, right? Because I prefer a mesh hull for PhysX objects that have been keyframed. And when we went in here in the birth object, we see that we said inherit position. So that's it as far as this top cylinder is concerned. For the rope, I just used snaps and I created a line and just 2 points. Remember, it can't be Bezier or you're going to get funny quantity of vertices along the line. And I just said 10%. I didn't want too many contact points on the rope, right? So you can see here the ticks, right? So I thought that was enough to create a flexible kind of rope. And the PhysX shape, convex hull was fine. There's absolutely no setting changes here or anything. So on the PhysX bind, originally I tried using tether or spring, and I didn't like them because they were way too jiggly in this scenario. So rigid joint was fine, and it is awesome. Now if you remember that movement kind of meant that these binds are allowed to stretch, right? And in this instance, I don't want stretching. This is kind of like a wire rope or something. We got a heavy magnet, so I just turned off this movement altogether. And then, but I do want them to swing, and I do want them to twist in case when they hit, I want this magnet and the rope to be allowed to like rotate, jiggle, bend, fold, right, and behave in that kind of manner. So I just set 1500 on the swing, 300 on dampening for both of them, and that produced a nice ropey kind of looking effect. And this is just set on event entry, right, like we have been doing. So on the electromagnet, right, it's just, all this is a short cylinder with a sphere attached at the top in the center point to give the bind a central spot to bind to on the electromagnet, and just to make it look right when you have the spline coming into the magnet, that it's going into this central sphere here, right? You can see the smaller sphere from the spline if you look carefully, and you can see the bigger sphere that's attached to part of the magnet object. And that's just a convex hull. If we showed a hole, it's not a perfect hole, you know, the string's gonna kind of go down there, but if we were making a production quality, maybe we tweak it, maybe we'd make these out of elements. Obviously it would look a lot better than this basic, you know, style drawing. And for here we used a PhysX bind glue on event entry. We only want it to happen once, and we're using the rigid glue because all we're trying to do is make sure this magnet sticks to this rope, right? And that's it. So we just got to make sure we don't make the bind any longer than it needs to be. It only needs to make one connection, right? If you have too long a bind, and say we do something like 30, I don't think it's set to show, it is, and we do something like 5, you can see that the bind is now creeping up the rope and interfering with our rope. Can you see how that's gone up? This red line versus the blue line, that's obviously really going to impact how this magnet, see that? So we don't want any longer here than what we really need to work to bind this magnet to the string on our pickup items. So remember that the magnet is 13 and the pickup items are 14, 15 and 16s on the ID. So really I've just birthed 3 shapes, and the convex hole is fine for the PhysX type, and I haven't changed anything here whatsoever just for this example. And now the important part, the PhysX bind. So we can't use on event entry here because it needs to be constantly looking for something to attach to. Alright, like, so once it lowers and reaches, and we can see that we've got the bind just a little bit long because we can see a gap in a bind right in the, maybe we can see it better here, not a good angle, but you can see that the cylinder is a little bit away, and you can see the bind is reaching out to grab the cylinder. But so the timing is continuous for that effect to happen, and I'm using rigid glue because I want these to be, once they attach, they should not animate whatsoever. We've got a powerful, strong magnet. They should be stuck to it, right? So what we need to do is, we're only allowing one bind per object because we don't want them to cross bind, right? Like, we don't want this cylinder, this sphere, to attach itself to this box, and we don't want this cylinder here, so we're not wanting cross connections. But we've got a filter on here that says that there's only a bind allowed to be made if the items are greater than 13. So in other words, we can only make a bind to 14, 15 or 16, right? So the magnet, when it comes down, will satisfy that rule because these items are all greater than 13, right? So that's how we're controlling that and stopping any cross connections. And the bind needs to be really as short as it needs to be for this to happen correctly, because we actually want the items to suck up hard against the magnet. In this case, we had a little problem here. The cylinder's a bit further away, so maybe something like 1 would have been better. Alright, so now we can see the cylinder is hard up against the magnet, and everything works like we would expect an electromagnet to work, except that if all this is heavy, this is way too jittery and way too jiggly. So let's fix the rope a little bit. Probably the easiest way for now would be to put some sort of slow operator on it, right? And I'm not sure what setting it's going to take, but 5 ain't going to cut it. So let's try something like 20. And maybe we'll put a little bit on spin, 5 on spin, and let's see how that looks now. So comes down, picks up the items. Whoa, we got something seriously wrong here. Not sure why that is happening, but that is a bug of some sort. I can see that. And maybe it's because of the spin. Yep, it was the spin. But it's alright, we still managed to slow it down by just adjusting this. So you saw that live in action, that there was a little craziness that went on when I tried to interfere with the spin. But other than that, we've got a fairly successful looking electromagnet setup. That's it for now. Take it easy, everybody. We'll come back with part 3.